Podcasting from Hartford, you're listening to the Connecticut Scoreboard Podcast.
So UConn back in the NCAA Tournament for the first time since 2016, and they get a matchup against the Maryland Terrapins. So Emily, thanks for coming on to give us the lowdown on this year's Maryland team.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So I know this Maryland team has had a really interesting year, it seems. They've got some great wins, some not so great losses at times. What's been the general story on this Terrapins team this year?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I don't think a lot of people thought they were going to make it to the tournament. They started the Big Ten season 4-9, and it seemed like they had a tough road ahead. But really, when you look at the schedule rationally, you can kind of step back and say, oh, wow, they played Michigan twice during that time. They played Illinois. They played Wisconsin. They played a lot of these really good Big Ten teams, and the schedule was totally front-loaded. So I think it was a combination of the schedule and then also them just figuring out how to play. So the biggest thing people will notice with Maryland is that they just don't have a center. They often play with a lineup and the tallest guy is 6'7", and that really held them back in the Big Ten. But I think as the season went on and they started to win some more games, the coaches just really committed to like, hey, let's just play the small lineup, shorten the bench, and really lean on defense. And that was kind of what sparked the turnaround. So there's definitely progress as the year went on, but always a few worrisome games where you're kind of like, wait, this team looks a lot different than it did a few nights ago. So you never really know what you're going to get.
Yeah, no, just from looking at the schedule there, it's like towards the end, you lose to Northwestern and Penn State, and then you go out and beat Michigan State, who's looked like they were kind of turning a corner there too. So it definitely seems like it's kind of been a tale of two teams and seeing which one shows up that night.
Right. And beat one at Illinois without their leading scorer.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, I guess that's basketball, but it's just kind of like, who knows?
When it comes to looking at this team, I know you mentioned, they don't really play with a center. I know their guards are pretty big too, which is going to be interesting, a really interesting matchup because the UConn guards are a little smaller. They're quick. So they've got that on them. But then again, when it comes to some of the big guys on UConn, should hold a rebounding advantage. And how do you kind of see that battle playing out there based on what you've seen of Maryland this year and the teams they've gone up against?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the game right there. It's like, can Maryland's length on defense like rattle UConn's guards enough that it kind of compensates for what I think is going to be a huge mismatch, particularly with UConn's offensive rebounding, but really just in general, like Maryland just doesn't really commit to that. Like they know they're probably not going to get too many. They just rather get back on defense. But that's what I'm fascinated to see. And the whole like Darryl Morsell James Bouknight is going to just be so fun. And Darryl Morsell has been really good when he has played those like elite scores. Like I think he just loves it. And he's also a great defender. So I think how well Maryland can rattle them there with kind of that like defensive length will be really interesting.
Yeah, and what you mentioned there with the Morsell Bouknight matchup, I think that's the one everyone's looking at going into this game. You got a NBA lottery pick potential there going up against the Defensive Player of the Year in the Big Ten, and that's just one I think everyone, especially that's what March is made for there.
Yeah, and that's I've only watched UConn a little bit, but they do seem like a team where they have a talented group of guards, but really if you can stop Bouknight, it seems like that's gonna be Maryland's primary path to trying to win this game. And Darryl Morsell's been really great in some of those matchups. Like he had held Marcus Carr to one of his worst games of the year, and then back last year when he played Marcus Howard from Marquette, he was really good. And it's almost like just kind of depending on how well that matchup goes, it should be really interesting, but it'll be really fun at least.
It will be. And Bouknight, I know, had probably his worst game of the season against Creighton in the Big East semis, and he seems to be pretty fired up, wanting to make his mark. So when you have both those guys going all out, I think it just makes for a really fun matchup to watch during the game. In terms of Maryland's style of play, how would you say they play under Mark Turgeon this year?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think I would say they don't play fast. I mean, they play pretty slow. They play small lineup with 5 guys who can shoot threes. And they really love when they get that mismatch with like Dante Scott plays at the 5 and he's one of the best 3-point shooters. So if they can get him kind of matched up on the perimeter against a big guy who, maybe isn't as quick or just gives him an advantage, That's been working really well. And then Eric Ayala and Aaron Wiggins were particularly good in the Michigan State game with trying to get to the rim. So they're not just like a straight up, let's just shoot a bunch of threes team. They're really athletic. But that's all like offensively, when really, I think if you ask anybody on this team, they say like they're going to win games with their defense. So when they just fully commit to that, they're great. But the thing, they switch so much. So like Turgeon says, like, for their defense to be great, which it can be, like all 5 guys have to be great. So it's almost like that margin of error for this team. It's like they can be so good, but they also kind of need to have like 4 guys playing great offensively at least. And then they need to all be really locked in defensively. And when they do that, they're great. But when one of those things isn't working, it can kind of go downhill pretty fast. Yeah, no,
and for UConn fans watching, I think this gives them some flashbacks to the matchup they lost against St. John's earlier this year when St. John's went small. Adama Sanogo, the big guy, had some trouble going out by the perimeter, and that was something St. John's was able to exploit down the stretch. So it's going to be something there that's interesting to watch.
Yeah, no, I bet that's a game like Mark Turgeon watches and is like, "Ooh, I like this."
Yeah,
I obviously didn't watch that game, but no, that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's definitely one I'm sure he's looking and trying to pick apart there. I know I've lived in the DC area for a bit under the start of Mark Turgeon. I know it's not always the smoothest road with him. In Maryland fans, what's kind of the feeling around the program this year?
Yeah, it's fascinating. I've been on the beat 3 years and it's never not been fascinating. Even when they had a great team last year, it's just like the question that haunts everybody because you know, the reality is like Turgeon's been here 10 years and he's only made it to the Sweet 16 once. And I think people feel like for a program that won national title in 2002, like you feel like they should have done more. What's really hard is that last year is the team that probably could have done it. Or if nothing else, would have offered some clarity, right? It would have been hard for that team to just achieve. It seems like they either would have gone to the tournament and given everyone so much confidence with an Elite 8 run or whatever it may have been, or they would have lost really early and people would have been like, how do you do that with this team? But we didn't get that clarity. So instead, you just kind of have this team that seems to have, or this program that has a pretty high floor. You know, they're never bad. Like Maryland has had tons of consecutive winning seasons long before Turgeon got here. But they also haven't really made a real run at winning a title. Like they hadn't won a conference title until last year. So the Turgeon question is just ever present. He has 2 years left on his contract after this year. So like something will have to happen in the offseason. And it is 100% the most often asked question for anybody in the fan base. It kind of is draining how often I get asked about it or just everything like that.
Yeah, I remember even early on it was always being asked, and I can only imagine it's picked up even more so of late. In terms of the team, one thing I forgot to ask earlier that I'm thinking about now, what's the depth on this Maryland team like? Are they going deep into a bench? No.
That's one of, again, it really, I think the thinking of this is like no margin of error is like such a great way to describe it because they have like 7.5 guys who play, you know, like sometimes they go to Reese Mona, who's like a former walk-on, now on scholarship, but is kind of turned into that 8th man. Whereas like last year, he was the type player who would like make a 3 in a blowout and the student section would go crazy. and like he doesn't mess up. He doesn't shoot a lot of shots, but like he is in the right places. Like they trust him. Like he has a role, but like that's their 8th player. And they really, I mean, those 5 stars are playing like over 30 minutes every night and they need them. So to answer your question, not very deep. Never want guys in foul trouble. I think I don't think Maryland would have been Michigan in the Big Ten tournament, but Darryl Morsell, like we've talked about, was on the bench the final, I think 7:50 of the first half. And that was when the game really slipped away because he had 2 fouls and honestly, maybe he should have stayed in the game. But they really just can't afford that with the depth they have.
Well, Emily, I really appreciate the time given the quick down low on Maryland here. I think UConn fans listening will kind of see this is kind of a classic 7-10 matchup. You'll hear some things throughout this that are like, oh yeah, we definitely can beat Maryland. And then there are some things where, hey, maybe there are some signs to pause for a little bit. But I think it's going to be a fun matchup. I know these teams have played each other a number of times. Well, both in the tournament and just during the regular season too. So I think it should be a fun one. So Emily, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, no problem. I think the game's gonna be great. I'm personally really excited for it.
Yeah, me too. Me too. So Emily, thanks again, and enjoy the game.